Have you ever been frustrated by your hosting provider? Do you find them slow to make the simplest of changes? A few years ago, I asked a hosting provider to install a program called Git. I was told it wasn't even possible. If I had had this course back then, I would have rolled my own hosting. Alas, this course didn't exist, but it does for you. Hello, my name is Daniel Platt, and I've built this course for you from my years of experience. If you ever want to build a server from scratch, or you just want an idea of what's involved, then sign up today. I'd like to say a big thank you for signing up on my course. Hopefully you get what the course is about. I'm really happy with VPS servers, and I'd like to tell you why and what you can do with them and how you could replace other servers like cPanel, because these hosting providers that offer you some sort of managed solution, they just install some software and then they sit back. They don't really do anything. They just have software that does it for them. If something goes wrong, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. It just happens. There was a bug in this version. We've accidentally turned off HTTPS on all your websites. Sorry. It's not an official service we offer. So problems like this take me like half a day dealing back and forth with their ticket systems. Whereas a server that I manage, I can solve the problem in 5 minutes. It boggles the mind. So I'm trying to teach you guys how you can do this for yourselves. If you can do it for a couple, then you'll understand how easy it is. And maybe manually it's not the best way forward, but you could automate it. You just need to have an understanding of what it is and why you need to do it. And I'm hoping in this course that you'll appreciate that. I really hope you love this course. And if you don't, then tell me why. I can't improve the course if I don't know. But this is coming from me, and I've been doing these server setups for the last 10 years. So I'm trying to cram in as much information into this course as possible. I can't do it all at once, but I've tried to put in as much as I can at launch, and if I've forgotten anything, then again, drop me a message, ask a question in the Q&A, because I want to help and I would like this course to grow with everybody. Thank you, and enjoy the learning. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the different types of hosting. You've got shared hosting, dedicated hosting, and VPS hosting. So let's talk about those in a bit more detail. Shared hosting. This is where you have lots of people sharing the same physical hardware. Because of this, providers can cram a lot more users onto one box, and it slows everybody down a fraction, but most of the time people don't notice it. You do have some providers that when at peak times the server will crawl to a snail's pace. And this is because all the websites are generating traffic at the same time. If you pay a bit more money for a shared hosting, then you're less likely to come across this problem. If you go on hosting where you pay £1, $1 a month, then you're more likely to hit this problem. The benefit of shared hosting is it's cheap. Because of all these extra users, providers don't need to charge as much per user for the cost of the hardware, for the cost of the networking. So it's a trade-off whether you want to. If you don't mind your website going a little bit slow, then it's perfect. It's also easy because most of them have got a very simple user interface. And because it's simple, a negative would be the configuration is less flexible. You can do less things. They've got less things installed because the more flexibility they offer, the more chance of including a feature that could slow down a server. Because you've got all these users on one server, you've got a lot more chance of there being a security risk. If the server's badly configured, then any one of those users could then potentially attack your website and download your data, your database. The flip side of shared hosting is dedicated hosting. Dedicated hosting is where you own or you are the sole user of a piece of hardware, a physical server. Most of the time you can dictate which operating system gets installed, which services get installed. I mean, usually you get given a server and then just told you can SSH in, here's your username and password, off you go. Usually you get support, but a lot of the time it's just hardware support. If you've got software problems, because you've configured that server, then you're a lot less likely to be able to... I mean, you can have what's known as managed dedicated hosting, which is where you have the shared hosting environment installed on your dedicated host. You'll have some of the negatives from shared hosting, like it's less flexible. You can't install what you want because the hosting provider doesn't understand it, doesn't support it, that sort of thing. Usually the biggest negative for dedicated hosting is that it's very expensive. You're usually talking a couple of $100 a month versus a few dollars. Which brings us on to the third type, VPS hosting, or virtual private server. This in a way is kind of a hybrid between shared hosting and dedicated hosting. There is a physical machine, but that's partitioned up. The hardware's kind of sliced up, and each segment has been given its own operating system. So they can guarantee you hardware resources of the CPU, the memory, the disk, this sort of thing. So it's a lot harder to over-provision this sort of thing. You tend to give one-to-one. So if you have a server with 16 cores in it, 16 CPUs, then you'd slice it up into 16 virtual servers, or 4 servers with 4 CPUs in it. So with a VPS, you have basic control of the hardware. It's usually just a slider sort of saying, I want 1 core, 1 CPU, 2 CPUs, and that will come with like 1-2 gigabytes of RAM. And that's enough to get you started. There usually is basic support, usually via ticketing or a phone, and you will tell them that you've got a problem with this and that, and they will help you to the best of their ability. Usually you're on your own with the community support, forums, this sort of thing. So why would I recommend VPS hosting over dedicated or shared? Well, I like to think that you get the best of both worlds. You get the cheapness of shared hosting, but it's not over-provisioned. You get the complete control of the software like you do with dedicated hosting. But you don't have everybody using your operating system, using your software, so there's less chance of being hacked from within. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about throughout this course, is how to set up a VPS and host your website on it. And at the same time, making it secure, or at least as secure as we can make it with today's known information. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the software that I'm going to install on it. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the software that I'm going to install on the VPS. I'm going to install Ubuntu, and I'm going to use the LTS 1604. The reason for this is because it's been around for a long time, it's stable, and it will be supported for another 3 years, which would take us to about 2021. So it will do us for another 3 years. Every good server that's doing website hosting needs a web server. And there's been a debate on the internet, for almost as old as the internet now, of which to use. And it usually comes down to Apache or Nginx. Apache was the current king, and then Nginx came along, and because it was faster at serving static files, like images or video. Now, 5 years ago, I started using Nginx, and I stopped using Apache. And this was because it was quicker, but more importantly, I felt the config, or the configuration, was a lot simpler. So, for these reasons, I'm going to tell you how to use Nginx in this course rather than Apache. For a database, there's lots of choices. But I found MySQL is the best supported. And I also like some of the tools that I use on the Mac that connect directly to it, like SQL Pro. So I'm going to use MySQL for this course. One of the sites I'm going to use is WordPress. We also need to install PHP. Ubuntu ships with PHP 7.0. And since Ubuntu shipped, 7.1 has been released, and 7.2, and I'm sure 7.3 soon. So what I'm going to do in a later lecture is show you how to install the latest version of PHP. And that is the basic software that I'm going to be using on this VPS. I'll see you in the next lecture. The internet isn't a safe place. Passwords are being brute forced, accounts are being hacked. It's not safe. So how do you connect to a server securely? What I use, and what most people do use, is something called SSH. And they use SSH keys instead of passwords. This is a lot more secure than just having some 8-character password or even a 20-character password. Instead of taking years to crack, would take centuries to crack, if not longer. So for this reason, let me show you how to generate an SSH key on a Mac or Linux. If you're on Windows, you need to use something called PuTTY, and I'll put in a link in the resources. So all you need to do is open up your command prompt, your terminal, and type in SSH keygen. And what that will do is it will generate your key pair. It will tell you where it's saving it. You just press enter. And in my case, I've already done this, so I don't want to overwrite it. When it's finished, you'll have these key pairs. And they will live inside your .ssh directory, inside your home directory. Let's make that a bit more obvious. Gosh. And you can see there, I created my SSH keys back in 2012. And what you'll need to do is you'll need the contents of your public key. ID_RSA is your private key, and ID_RSA.pub is your public key. The idea is your private key you keep 100% safe, you don't reveal it to anybody. Your public key, you can give it out to everybody, and they use that to verify that you are you based on some challenges they do between the two keys. So it's pretty secure. So what you'll need to do is view the contents of your public key, and in a later lecture you'll need to copy and paste that, and we can add it into, say, DigitalOcean or another server to allow automatic login. I'll see you in the next lecture. For my online hosting, I use a company called DigitalOcean. Their philosophy is very simple. They give you the raw computing power, and then you build something awesome on top. And that's reflected in their pricing. The ones I will be looking at are the standard droplets. And depending on your needs, you can pay as little as $5 a month, or you can pay as much as you want, have as many servers as you want. But for this course, I'm going to focus on the $5 a month one, which with the free credit, if you use my referral link, you can have at least a couple of months free without having to pay anything. And when you're testing, you don't need to spend a lot. But when you're in production, it might be that you need a little bit more oomph, a little bit more memory for caching, or more cores to enable your application to handle more traffic. But we can talk about that later. So you're going to want to sign up, but I already have an account, so let me log into mine. So I'm going to assume you have an account, and when you log in, this will be what you're greeted with. So the first thing you're going to want to do is create a droplet. And you want to make sure you're choosing Ubuntu 16.04. And we'll scroll down to the size, and for this purposes, we're going to choose the 1 GB, $5 a month. We don't need to worry about block storage. And for data center, you need to choose the location that's closest to your customers. I'm going to leave it on London. Additional options is great. You can have backups, which, as it says, it adds 20% to the monthly droplet cost. And it takes a backup once a week and retains the last 4 weeks. So it's pretty handy if you want to roll back. For these purposes, I'm not going to enable backups. However, I recommend that you consider it, and certainly if you're in production. For IPv6 rather, you don't need it. However, if you add it, it's a lot easier than adding it later. You don't have to take advantage of it, but if it's enabled, then at least you're assigned an IP address. Don't worry about user data. And I would recommend you turn on monitoring because it gives you some nice metrics about the CPU and memory utilization. SSH keys. With these servers, there are 2 different ways you can authenticate when you log in. One is with a username and password. And unfortunately, most people know what the username is, which is root. So it could just be a matter of time. You can get around it by creating a second account and disabling login to root. However, what I like to do is use SSH keys. They're a lot harder to guess, in fact, nigh on impossible. But you do have to look after them. If anyone gets your private key, then it's kind of game over. They can log into anything, you can. So I'm going to show you how to set up SSH keys on this server, which also has the nice side effect of disabling the password login. So we'll do new SSH key. And in here we just need to paste in your public key. So let's get the one we generated earlier. So we copy that, paste it in here, and give it a name so you remember which one it is. You can also edit your account to store your SSH keys. And next time you create a server, it'll just appear here, and you can just tick it rather than pasting it in every time. In this instance, we're only going to want one server, so unless you're creating a whole load of servers at the same time, just leave this one as one droplet. And hostname, you can leave it as blank, or you can treat this as the reverse domain name. So if someone was trying to find the IP address and the hostname associated, this would be what would be resolved. So you can type in a full domain name here. This will only benefit you if you set your domain name to point at this server. And you can also add tags if you want, whatever you want to help you filter on the dashboard. And you just type it in, hit enter. And then hit create. And there you go. My server, my IP address. And if you click into it, we can just click on here. You can actually see everything about it. So if you want to turn it off. Snapshots is a good one. It's like backups, but you are in control of when you take them. So if you're going to do anything that you're not sure about, you can take a snapshot and you can always roll back to it. And that's it for this lecture. During this course, I'm going to be using DigitalOcean. However, if you don't want to use DigitalOcean, you can use any other provider as long as they provide you a VPS with SSH login. That said, there is also a free alternative. It won't allow you to test your server online, but if you just need it for local access and you only need it running on your computer, then you can use something called VirtualBox. And you can download it from here. And VirtualBox is supported on Windows, macOS, Linux, and others. All you need to do is download the package. You then need to install the package. And whilst we're here, we might as well get the extension pack. Let's download that as well. let's install VirtualBox. So this is the Mac. It'll be different on the Windows computer. Okay, so let's install it. Oh, it's failed. I've been doing some reading on the internet, and it seems like there's new security procedures in OS that are stopping this. So let's sort that out. So you want to go to security, which is there, security and privacy. Okay. System software from Oracle was blocked from loading. So we just want to allow that. And now, hopefully, if we rerun the installer, we shouldn't have the same problem. And there we go. Seems to be working fine now. And we don't need the installer anymore, so we can move it to the trash. So we need to get a copy of Ubuntu. So we just need to go to Ubuntu, let's go to downloads, and we need to get the server version, not the desktop version. And we click download. So it'll take a little while to download. Okay, so that's downloaded. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the extension pack. So wherever it is on your desktop or your downloads directory, you just need to double click it. And that will ask you if you want to install it inside VirtualBox. I recommend you do read the terms and conditions, but when you do, click agree. This is just installing extra drivers to allow the machine to work slightly better. So let's create our first virtual machine. I'm going to call mine example machine. VirtualBox is trying to guess what type of machine I'm going to be installing, but as it's got Mac, it's kind of guessing it's a Mac, but we need to choose Linux and Ubuntu. If I'd named it Ubuntu, it would have picked it for us. And we're just going to use the same defaults as DigitalOcean. So that's 1 GB of RAM. And the hard drive, we're going to choose 25 GB. But because it's a dynamic drive, it doesn't matter. It's not going to take up the whole 25 GB until you actually start using that within the virtual machine. So let's quickly go into the settings. I want to make sure that we've got one core, which is exactly what we've got in DigitalOcean. Audio, I'm going to disable because we don't need audio. And storage, we need to basically choose the ISO that we've just downloaded from Ubuntu. And we just say OK to that. Now what we need to do is start the virtual machine, and if everything's gone to plan, it will boot up. So you just need to choose the language you're most comfortable with, and hit enter, enter again. And for a lot of these defaults, you're just going to be choosing enter or using the arrow keys to move around. I'm not too worried about detecting the layout because your operating system will be doing that for you, as in your host operating system. This install is going to be slightly different to the DigitalOcean one, but it's mostly because DigitalOcean will have customized their install to remove a lot of the extras that Ubuntu server may be coming with, or they may have added in a few extras of their own. And that's networking being configured. This is just like the DigitalOcean host name. You can have whatever you want, but again, I'm just going to call the example exactly the same and hit enter. This doesn't have the niceties of asking you for an SSH key to start with. You're going to have to create a user that you can then escalate to root to do all your editing. So I'm just going to go with Daniel, and then I'm going to choose a password and hit enter, and then again repeat the same password. And no, I don't want to encrypt it. Yes, the time zone is correct. And again, unless you know what you're doing, I would just stick with the defaults for how to format your disk. And you need to say yes, write the changes to the disk. And hit enter again. Finally say yes again. Okay, unless you connect to a proxy to use the internet, let's leave this blank. Whether you want to install automatic updates is up to you. Installing security updates automatically won't make sense unless this virtual machine is on all the time. But for simplicity, it's probably better to just leave it as no automatic updates, and then you manually run the updates later, which I'll go over in another lecture. And what we need to do here is we need to turn on Open SSH Server. So what you do is use the arrow keys and then the space bar to select and deselect. And that is it. Oh, and hit tab to come down to the continue, and then hit enter. And this is going to install all the system packages and the SSH, because by the end of this we will be connecting to it the same way as we do the DigitalOcean server. And finally, you do need to install the grub loader, the grub bootloader, because that's how your virtual machine boots. And let's hit continue to reboot. Okay, so logging in is a simple matter of remembering the username and password that you set. Okay, and that's you logged in. You can log in this way, but I find this terminal a little bit clunky. You can't resize it as much as you want. The copy and paste sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So what I recommend is logging out of this. However, one thing we do need to know is what your IP address is. And you can see it there, 10.0.2.15. Now, you can carry on using this interface if you want, but I prefer to use my native terminal. So let's log out and forget this exists. And if I load up terminal, here's one we had earlier, and we type SSH Daniel 10.0.2.15. And it doesn't work. Right. Let's load up VirtualBox again. Quickly go into settings, network. Alright, let's try bridged adapter, and then we'll choose the Wi-Fi that I'm using. In your case, it could be an Ethernet port. Let's do that. Let's reboot this box just to be sure. Okay. So what we've done is we've put the virtual machine directly on the network, which is why the IP address has changed format. So in this case, it's 192.168.1.131. So let's try that. Okay, because we've never connected to this virtual machine before, we don't know what the fingerprint is. Computer's way of identifying the remote server. So let's just say yes, because we know. Type in your password, and there we go. You've got a much better terminal right here. Now, to get to the state where we are with DigitalOcean, or where we'll be in the next lecture with DigitalOcean, we need to create a directory called SSH. And inside there, we need to put a file called authorized_keys. And all that we need in there is our SSH key. Now this is something that DigitalOcean will have done for us. And then you just hit Control X, press Y to save, and hit enter. Now, if we log out and we reconnect, we shouldn't be prompted for the password. So let's have a look at what's happened. What we've done is we've created the authorized keys file, but we've not put it in the SSH folder. So let's type move authorized keys.ssh, and that's going to move it into there. So now if we exit and now connect, there we go. We're now connected without requiring the password. But there's one more thing that DigitalOcean will do, is that we'll be connecting directly to the root user, and for this we need to go via our user. So to get to the root user, we just need to type sudo -s, and that will give us super user doing with a shell. So if we type that and then we type our password, that is where we will be with DigitalOcean. So if you see me connecting to DigitalOcean as root at IP address, then you need to follow the steps here. You need to type SSH, your username, at your local IP address, and then type sudo -s followed by your password. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to take a minute to talk about passwords. I've briefly spoke about using SSH keys to log in, and I've said passwords aren't necessarily the best thing to use. But I want to talk about why. The trouble with passwords is you can brute force them. And by brute forcing I mean you try all A's and then the last one being B, all A's and then the last one being C, and keep going. Computers are very good at this. And humans are really bad at choosing unique passwords, which is why we've got password complexity. Like, your password needs to be at least 8 characters. It needs to use uppercase and lowercase, and include a number, and include a symbol. And this makes it really hard for people to remember the password. So people are using password managers. We can bypass that with SSH keys. But let's talk about why. Let's talk about bits of entropy. If you created a 7-character password, that's 40 bits of entropy. To a computer, that's just binary. It calculates its way through it, and assuming that the system allows you to check the password as often as you want, then that password could be broken in 20 minutes, or within 20 minutes. If your password was 7 characters, and was alphanumeric, and included a symbol, and that's assuming your password was 7 characters, and included alphanumerics, and symbols. If the same password was 11 characters long, that'd be 64 bits of entropy. And then you're looking at nearly 585 years to crack that password, which is not bad. But if you use a dictionary word, then that's dramatically lower, because computers can easily figure that one out. They just need a dictionary. even if you just start substituting A for the @ symbol or L's for ones, there's a lot less possibilities, combinations that you could be using. When you create an SSH key, you're likely to get 2048 bits of entropy. And if you think going from 40 bits to 64 bits went from minutes to years, think what going from 64 bits to 2048 bits will do. It is unfathomable that you could brute force that. Maybe in the future with quantum computers, but at this moment in time, SSH keys give you the best possibility for securing your server. So I'm going to tell you how to turn off password authentication, because if you're with DigitalOcean, you should have put the SSH key in creation. If you didn't, you can follow the free alternative in the last lecture to add your key into the authorized keys file. So let's assume that you've done that. You've done the authorized keys file so you can log in with your SSH key or your password. Well, if you're using SSH keys, great. But then you've still got the possibility of logging in with your password, so somebody could still brute force you. Let's turn off password authentication. Let's grab the IP address again. And this is the first time I've connected to this DigitalOcean box. And what we want to do is type nano etc ssh and then sshd _ config. And if we scroll down, we're looking for password authentication. Now, mine says password authentication no. And that means SSH will not allow passwords. By default, you'll probably see password authentication with the hash symbol in front of it. That means that it's commented out and it has no effect. So you'll need to remove the hash symbol and also make sure this says no. And then you'll need to exit out, Control X, press Y, and then press enter to write the file. Now you've updated the config, but SSH is still running in the background and it won't have made any difference. So you need to restart SSH, which is service SSH restart. And now you'll no longer be able to log in with that password. By doing this, there is one less avenue that an attacker can attack your server. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to talk about the skeleton directory. The skeleton directory in Linux, it is the directory used to create a new user folder. So anything in there gets copied across when a new user is created. So let's check it out. We'll connect to the server, and its location is /etc/skel. So you can see in there's already a few files. But one of the tricks I've got is if we create an SSH folder in there, and inside there an authorized keys file, we can log directly into any new user we create. So let's do that. So we'll make a directory .ssh and we'll change the permissions of that to 0700, which just means only the owner of that folder has full read and write permissions. So, and what we can do is, if you're happy with your authorized keys file, you can copy that to here. So let's check that out. So there you go. You can see the .ssh folder with read and write permissions for the owner, the RWX. And if we go into the .ssh folder, let's check it out. We now have the authorized keys file, and in there will be the original key that you created. If you have more than one machine, you can copy those in. So whichever computer you're on, you can log into from it. So now when you create a new user, you'll be able to log into it just as you've logged into root. And it will just be user at, and then the server IP address or server name. And I'll see you in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we set up the skeleton directory. So in this lecture, let's set up the web server. And as I said in the beginning, we're going to be using Nginx. Now I don't want to use the Nginx that comes with Ubuntu LTS because it's getting a little bit old, and I don't see any harm in using the latest stable release of it. So we need to add something called a PPA. And to do this, let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is type add apt repository. And then we need to type PPA Nginx /stable. So this is telling us that these are the only chips they support, and these are the distributions of Ubuntu they support. So if you're happy to proceed, and I know I am, then hit enter. And when you add a PPA, you need to do apt update, just to let Aptitude pull in the latest sort of file changes from them. And now we can do apt install Nginx. And this is going to tell us exactly what it's installing. As Y is the default, we can hit enter. And this will install Nginx for us. I'm going to show you a quick minor change to Nginx config. So we take server tokens and make them off. This is just so we don't advertise which version of Nginx we're currently using. It's just a minor thing to aid a little bit in security. And if you Control X and Y to save. In a later lecture we'll be configuring Nginx, but for now we're going to move on to installing your database and PHP. In this lecture we're going to install MySQL. So let's jump right in. We're going to type apt install MySQL -server. And this is going to install MySQL Server 5.7. I'm not too fussed about pulling in the latest changes for MySQL because not a lot has changed. There is a big release coming out soon, which is MySQL 8, but I'm waiting to see what happens with that. So for the moment, we're going to stick with 5.7. And if we just hit Y or enter, which is the default, you need to choose a secure password. Something that you're going to remember because you're going to need to log into it potentially to give you an overview of all your databases. But it needs to be secure enough that nothing can brute force your password. The risk of it being brute forced is a lot less than with SSH because we're not going to expose MySQL to the world. But still, a malicious script on your server could be checking your MySQL and trying to brute force a connection without you even noticing it. So I would recommend a good strong password. But at the moment I'm going to just choose a very simple password. And there you go, MySQL is installed. And it's also running. In the next lecture we'll install PHP. Let's install PHP. Let's reconnect. And for this one we will be using a PPA because PHP is fast moving. When 1604 was released a couple of years ago, you had 7.0. We've now got PHP 7.2. So it makes sense to get the latest one. So we need to use add apt repository and it's PPA Andre /PHP. And all this is saying is that you need to, they only provide supported releases of PHP. So let's hit enter to carry on. And like last time, we need to do apt update. And let's have a look at what we've got. So we can do a list. And you can see here all the different PHP options you have. So let's look at 7.2. You've got the main version, you've got FPM, which is what we're going to use, and a few other modules. So let's just install some of the basic modules. So apt install PHP 7.2 FPM, PHP 7.2 XML, PHP 7.2 international support, and we're going to need PHP 7.2 MySQL. I think we should also get PHP 7.2 op cache. And whilst we're here, why not get JSON? And probably a good idea is to get GD, which allows PHP to manipulate graphics. We don't need to pick everything at once, but these are some of the common ones that you'll probably need later. We can always install more at a later date. So let's just install those. Okay, let's have a look. And there you go, you've got PHP running. It's using its default config, which is why you've got pool www, but we'll change that later. One per website. And before we go, I want to tweak the config to basically not expose PHP. So what we're looking for is expose PHP. Okay, by default it's already off, but it's worth double checking, because if it's on, you'll be saying this was generated using PHP with this version. If it's off, then an attacker needs to guess. So we save. That's it for this lecture and all the dependencies. We'll move on to actually setting up a website in the next lecture. I know when I set up servers, I don't know all the possible websites I'm going to host on it when I first set it up. For that reason, I'm trying to design this course so that you go through the course once per user per website, so that every time you need to set up a new user, you can go through and then sort of pick your own adventure for different types of website, for different types of config. And I'm hoping that this will allow you to extract more value from this course. So this section is all about setting up the website user and the PHP config that goes with it, because that's not going to change too much. The PHP config, you'll be changing a few values, yes, but Nginx config can get quite complex, so we'll talk about that in another section. In this lecture, I want to talk about how, so far, all we've done is set up a few dependencies. Why don't we now set up our first user? The way I treat users when I set up servers is each website is encapsulated with a single user. That way, if a website has been attacked, there's very little they can do. They could potentially brute force MySQL, but hopefully put a secure password when you create them, or your root user for MySQL. We've turned off SSH. We've turned off user passwords. There's potentially some config for Nginx and PHP they could look at. Arguably they can't do any damage with it, but it would give them more intel to attack other websites. In another lecture, we'll look at hardening your server against this. So let's add this user. And as I say, this is a particular one for a website. So let's connect to the server, and I'm going to set up example.ovdan.com because it's what I named the server. It makes sense, it's the first website. So what we need to do is type user add -d, and this is the home directory, and I tend to put everything in var www, and then I give it a home directory, and I typically use the domain name. We also want to give it a group users. This will help us later. And we're using -m to get it to make the user directory, and this will also copy in the shell directory which we modified earlier. -s to give it a shell. bin/bash is good enough. And then the username. This could be example. I tend to go with the domain name, so ovdan, or the domain name _ subdomain. So I'm going to go with ovdan _ example. This way it's easier to remember which user to log into which website. If you enter, and then that's been created. So if we have a look in var www example, and there you go. That is exactly like the skeleton directory. We also want to change the group that owns this folder to www-data. So this will let Nginx get into the folder and also stop other users being able to get in. And just to complete it, we need to type chmod and change the permissions to read and write execute for the owner, read and execute for Nginx, and for everybody else, no permission. You should put the 0 at the front. It can be inferred without it, but... And again. And one last step. If we log into this user, we can also type SSH Keygen. And this will give us a private key and a public key for this particular user. So if we use Git to deploy later, we can use this particular one. So that's it for the user creation. In a later lecture, we'll talk about how to put your web files in there. In this lecture, we're going to talk about setting up the PHP config. Now, not every website needs PHP. It could be a static website with just HTML and images. Okay, you don't need PHP, so don't bother with this step. If you're using WordPress or Symfony, then you're going to need PHP. So I'm going to assume I'm going to need PHP for this example website. So let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is go into the PHP directory. And in here will be a folder for each version of PHP. We installed 7.2, so there's only 7.2 here. But what happens if we installed 7.2 and 7.1? Well, you'd have config for both. And you can actually run both versions of PHP very happily on the same server. But it will come down to how you configure them to see whether it will work. And we'll go over that in a bit. So let's go into the 7.2 directory. And in here, you again have two different directories. I mean, mods available is just all the different modules that are available, which are linked to, so ignore that directory. The other two directories, CLI and FPM. CLI is the PHP configuration for the command line. Now, most of the time, you don't need to worry about that. FPM is what we use to connect Nginx to PHP. So that is where the config lies that we need to modify. The FPM config is pretty much, you're not going to need to change it. It's how PHP spawns new pools So you can see at the bottom there, that's where the pull directories live. But a lot of these configs you're not going to need to change. You may change them later on when you know a lot more about it, but for this moment in time, don't touch. What else do we have in here? You've got the conf directory, and that is where the modules are linked in that we saw a minute ago. So if you want a new module installed, apt will be putting a link in here to the module. You can also go into one of these and put module specific config in there. So if we look at, let's look at the MySQL one, it's mostly just telling it where the config is. So lastly, we have the pull.d directory. And this is where your website PHP configuration is going to live. The www one is the default one. You can use that for every single one of your websites. The trouble is, it's running with generic permissions, which would mean if one website got hacked, they have the potential to attack all your websites. And that's something we don't want. We're going to run PHP as the website user. And that means that user is almost locked into that directory. The only thing it will be able to see outside is anything that's been given everybody or world permissions to read. So let's go into the www one. In here is a list of all the parameters, or most of the parameters, that you can change with explanations. And we are going to be typing a lot of these in, but I'll explain what they are. But if you want more explanation, you can look at this file and it'll be able to help you. But when you're ready, I would recommend removing that file. You can copy and paste it somewhere else for reference, but we don't need it, and it's going to be taking up resources on your server in terms of memory, mostly memory, but potentially CPU. The website we want to configure is ofdan_example. So let's type that in. And hopefully you've noticed I'm keeping the username consistent with this PHP. And that's a theme I'm going to be using. Again. And this is what will be listed under pool if you were to do that list of processes. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell it to run as the ofdan user. We need to give it a group of users, which was the default group we gave it when we created that user. We need to tell it where the sock file is, or the socket, and this is how we're going to communicate with Nginx. So we're going to say var run php, and we're going to give it a version number, fpm.ofdanexample.sock. We're going to need to remember that path for when we set up Nginx. And also, by including the version number of PHP in that file, we can run multiple versions of PHP. So in the future, when PHP 7.3 comes out, and by default, we will have no websites running for it, no pools. And what we could do is we can copy across this file, but changing that version number, and we could have both running. And then we could test with Nginx to see that that website works or not in the new version. And then when we're happy, we can then remove the old config file, restart PHP, and then you can slowly move your websites from the old version of PHP to the new version of PHP. Or maybe you want PHP 5.6, which is still supported at the moment, because it doesn't work in PHP 7. With this, you have a lot of flexibility. And we need to say who can listen, or who can answer. We also need to say who is allowed to use this socket file. So what we'll say is only www data can, and that's Nginx. And again with the group. And we'll confirm that with the permissions. And we'll say the mode is 0660. So only the owner and the group are allowed to read and write to this. And we'll also say allowed clients 127.0.0.1. So they have to be on the server to be able to make this connection. Though that may only apply if it's a port number. And for my example, I'm going to use the dynamic. In my example, the process mode is going to be dynamic. Dynamic allows it to shrink and grow based on traffic or number of requests. You've got static, which whatever you define coming in the next few lines, it won't change regardless of how little or how much traffic. And you also have on demand, which means if you have no traffic at all, they'll get killed off and you'll have no PHP running until the first request. So let's define some limits. Max children. Max children is the total number of PHP processes that will be allowed to run. And we want to say, let's start 2. But we only want 1 spare. So if one stops being used, then it will stay. If one gets killed off, it will then restart another one just to maintain that you've still got 1 spare. And then you've got max spare servers. Oh, missed an S off there. So maybe we won't want 2. You also have max requests. And this is how many requests that each process deals with before it then gets killed off. It's to stop things like memory leak. So if you've got a process that leaks memory, the memory can be freed up by killing off the actual PHP process. I will also link you to the documentation in PHP that explains a lot more about this. And you've got websites that tell you how you should calculate these numbers. But I can't really help you with how to calculate these numbers because it depends on how little or how much traffic you're going to get, how heavy your application is. Maybe you only need a few requests, but they need hundreds of megabytes each, in which case if you've got a gig of RAM, you could only run 5 because they'd be using 200 megas each. Or maybe you only use 10 megs, which means you could run 100 of them before it maxes out. Well, you also have the problem with if you've got loads of websites, then you're going to be running these as well. So it's kind of a juggling act, which is why I've got dynamic, but on demand could work, because if you've got a website that only gets traffic once an hour or only for 1 hour a day, and most of the time it's idle, then you could free up that memory and reuse it somewhere else. So I'll link you to some resources that help you try to understand what numbers you should be using. But as a starting point, this will get you going. So created a user for the website. Does your website need a database? If it does, then you'll need to do this step, which is create a user and a database for this website. So we need to connect to our server as root. And what we'll need to type is MySQL-u for user, which is root-p to prompt us for the password. Now hopefully you remember the password from earlier when you set up MySQL. So enter it now. There you go. This is MySQL. And what you need to do is type create database, and what we need is these backtick symbols. You can do it without, but it's safer to do it with, just in case you come across some characters that MySQL is not entirely happy with that isn't escaped. And we're going to keep the consistency, and we're going to call it ofdan_example, and don't forget the semicolon. We now need to say create user, and this time using quotes ofdan example, close quotes, at, and this time we're going to say localhost identified by, and this will be the password. Now again, this password does need to be reasonably secure because you don't want it to be brute forced by another user. So I've personally created a website that generates passwords, passwords.ofdan.com. So if we use one of these and paste it in here, and again, not forgetting the semicolon. We have a database, we have a user, but we need to tell MySQL that this user has access to this database. We do that by saying grant all on ofdan example dot star. So this is the database, and the star is for every table. And this is the same as the user. And there we go. If at any point you want to change the password, you can log in again and you can just say set password for ofdan example at localhost equals, and then password, and then paste your password in there, and then that will reset the password to whatever you provide. If you make changes to the users, the permissions, or the password, you also need to type flush privileges. Otherwise, MySQL is still using the old settings, just like you did if you changed the config for Nginx or PHP. So that's your user and your database. Make a note of those and your password, because you'll need them for when we install WordPress later on. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this section, we are going to talk about Nginx config. I'm going to break it down into various lectures. So a lecture for static content, a lecture for PHP content. So just like the other sections, you'll be able to pick which one applies to you, or cherry pick bits of config from various ones. But it's not all going to apply to each and every website. There's no point including the ability to process PHP if it's a static website. And if there's a framework that I've missed, then drop it in the comments, and if there's enough demand, I will do one for that as well. So you've gone to the trouble and you've made a static website. Let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is we need to go to our Nginx folder. Okay, so at the moment we have no config except for our default page. And if we have a look in that, because there was a lot of interesting bits, the bit we really are interested in is this last bit at the end, this server block. So what I want to do is I want to copy that, and we're going to create a new file. We're going to name it the same as our domain name, following the username pattern. We'll paste that in. Now anything that has a hash is a comment, so we need to remove all those. and we need to give it the correct name. So I was going with example.ofdan.com, and this is your server name, whatever domain name that you've got pointing at the IP address of your server. If you don't have a domain name, then you can specify the IP address, or you can edit your host files and point anything at your server IP address. But I'm going to assume you have a domain name. And this would be the directory. And that's what it should be. And then you just need a location block that matches everything. And if something doesn't exist, just returns a 404. So if we save that, Control X, Y, hit enter. Now we've created this site, we haven't linked it up yet. So what we need to do is we need to go into your sites enabled, and in there we still need to create a symlink. So what we need to do is we need to type the path to that file we've just created, and like that. We can hit enter. It's going to use exactly the same name. And now if we look in there, we can see that the file is pointing to, in Windows terms, it's just a shortcut or an alias on the Mac. But in terms of Linux, it's called a symbolic link. And once we've done that, we just need to do Nginx reload. And then you get a 404. And then you get a 403. Okay. But if we were to try and search for something, right, okay. What we need to do is if we log into that user, and whilst I'm here, I'm just going to remove the htdocs because there is nothing in there. Make directory htdocs. So we've got a clean slate. So if we create that index file like so, and then we reload the page, it's working. Why did we get a 403? Well, I suspect that's because if we look back at the actual file, we weren't looking for a file, we were just doing /. And this index tells the Nginx to sort of say, if you don't get a file, substitute it with this. And because it didn't exist, I suspect it's going to be that the default file causes a 403. But any other missing file will be a 404. And you could see that when I typed in index.html, that it then changed to a 404. So that's how you serve static files. You want to be careful with this, because I'm sure if we were to then create a file called, let's create for example, an SSH folder, and inside there, and we type in that file we've just created. Okay, it's just downloaded it. But it's worked. So you've got to be careful with the static one because it just shows you everything. There is no security, there's no filter. We will sort this out later with snippets, but just bear this in mind. And this is another reason why I use a htdocs rather than dumping you straight into the user folder, because there's so many folders and files. You can see in this folder here, you've got caches, configs, all sorts that even your bash history would be a terrible one for somebody to get hold of. So just know that this Nginx config will let somebody download absolutely everything in that folder. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to talk about the WordPress Nginx config. So let's jump straight in. First thing we need to do is make sure we have a WordPress install. So let's get one of those. Spell that wrong. There we go. So there we go. I've just downloaded and installed WordPress. So what we need to do, if we log out, and then first thing we'll do is we'll log back into root, and then we can set up the config, because it's a lot easier to set up the config once you've deployed your website. And what we want to do is, it doesn't matter at this point whether we're doing our sites enabled or available, because we've already set up the symlink. If we were setting up a new site, then yes, you'd have to go in var available and then symlink that once you're done. So our index file is PHP. So if there is nothing on the URL, then we need to enter, it needs to default to index.php. There's no harm in leaving the index.html, because if you wanted to turn off the website for some reason, then you could. But there's also no harm in just having index. And then index.php. And then what you need is a little block to process PHP files, because at the moment Nginx doesn't know what to do with them. And I'm going to paste it in here. And this is just saying that if a file is PHP, or the file extension is PHP, then include this file. It just does a bit of setting up of PHP and how to connect to PHP. And this is something we set up when we set up the PHP config earlier. And this will be one per website. So the pattern we were using was, this was your website. And that's it. I mean, you could do without this location block, but this also helps us serve our static assets. And even though you've got a PHP website, you still need some images, some CSS, and that's what's going to be serving those files. So if we quit and save, and because we've changed the config, we still need to reload the Nginx. And now, if we go to the actual website, it will redirect us to WordPress's setup. So if we click continue, it just tells us we need to set up the config. So our details from earlier was ovdan_example for the database name, and also the username, and the password was the one we specified as well. Table prefix is an interesting one. If you want to run multiple WordPresses in the same database, then you need to use a different prefix. You could go as simple as WordPress 1, WordPress 2, etc. However, it's also a good idea to use different prefixes, because if you're being attacked, then a lot of assumptions are going to be made, and people are going to assume you're using the same table prefix. It's not going to stop everything, but it's more of a speed bump, so it's worth changing it. Probably something a bit more complex than that, but... And then we just run the installation. And there you go. It's a very simple system. In a later section, we'll talk about how to customize this to make it a bit more secure and a bit more rich with like redirects. But for now, that is how you get WordPress up and running. I'll see you in the next lecture. Let's get Nginx working with Symfony. So we'll log in, we'll just double check the website's all set up. And what we'll do is just do that. Okay, so we have a Symfony project. And now let's log in as root. And let's check to see what happens when we try to use it now. So we're getting forbidden. First thing we need to remember with Symfony is that it uses a public folder. So whilst the project lives in htdocs, its entry point for the web server is actually in the public folder. So if we reload that, Nginx reload, and now the difference with Nginx and PHP is that WordPress doesn't try to manipulate the URL. Every bit that you access in WordPress is a discrete PHP file. With Symfony and other frameworks, they'll run everything through an index.php. So in the URL, you've got /en. That needs to be run through the PHP. So let's go into the config and sort that out. In fact, actually, let's go to Symfony's documentation. On Symfony's website, there's lots of great documentation. And what I'll do is I'll link you to the right section so that you don't have to type it in manually. But when you're doing this, you need to ask yourself a question. Which version of Symfony are you using? If you're using 2 or 3, or if you have a web directory, then you want version 3.4 of this document. If you have a public folder, or version 4, then you want version 4. I'll link to both. It'll be simple. Now I know that I need this version for my project. And what you need to do is go down to the Nginx section. And what I'm going to do is we're going to copy and paste this file and we'll make the modifications ourselves. Because a lot of it we've already done. We go down the bottom. I haven't covered this before, but your error log and your access log, it's always a good idea to give it a name. So in my case, I like to stick with the actual website name. Because there's nothing worse than trying to track down a bug with the error log and it's all mushed into one file. So we scroll up. Oh yes, you do have parameters, but in my particular application, we don't have any. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that line, Control K, and I want to put it there, Control U. And we'll get rid of that line. That's just our socket. And what we'll do is we'll also get rid of all these lines. So what you end up with is an amalgamation of the two that we had. It's the Symfony one, but with our URL. I will also put this in the resources for you. Okay, so we'll save that. We'll reload Nginx and hopefully we'll be somewhere better off. And there you go. And that was pretty simple. One thing I will go back to is actually that config, because we need to run that app in prod. You can tell it's in dev mode because you've got the debug toolbar, and you should never be running a Symfony app in dev mode in production. So that's a big no-no. So back in our config, what we want to do is find the parameter app_env, and that just means the environment. And we'll delete that hash symbol, and it will just tell it to be in prod mode. So we'll save and reload the config, and hopefully we reload now. This was unexpected. Now I've just checked, and it's because I haven't specified all the parameters in the Nginx config. So let's specify them all. I mean, how do we know what the parameters are? Well, I mean, this is only a Symfony 4 thing. So if you're using Symfony 3 or less, then you're not going to have this problem because they're all specified within the project. Inside the Symfony projects, there's a .env file. The dist one is the thing that gets distributed, and the env one is the one that's been, I think, generated when Composer installed it. So let's check the env one. So we can see it wants app env, app secret, and another one called GA tracking. So let's make sure that they're specified. Well, app secret is already defined but commented out. And we specify app GA tracking there. I don't know if that's going to work, so let's try that instead. And now, there we go. No, we don't. Mostly works. Oh, let's quickly check. I can show you how I check the logs. So the app itself has got logs, and they are in var log prod, and that's within the htdocs. Okay, it's just a bug in my code. A file not found. So that is how you install Symfony. Once you get the hang of it, it's straightforward. And personally, I felt the old way was a bit easier, but I'm showing you the new way because going forward, that's what it's going to be. But drop a line in the comments if you've got any problems. I'll see you in the next lecture.